shades now because people come in late.
If you can hear me,
If
put your hands on your head.
Well, no, if I put those shades down, these all will go down. Does it matter?
Yeah, don't.
Sure.
Alright, like people, you can't
Put them
really
down.
see it.
Yeah, the reflection's gonna bounce back. I put a mic up on the podium.
That always works. Took a minute? Thank you very much. So we're going to get started. If you have not found a seat, there are plenty up front. We did not require that children sit with their parents. To sit in groupings that make sense for all of you. Good evening and welcome. Tonight is the first of the 2015-16 Upper School SEED Extension events. SEED stands for Social, Emotional, Ethical Development. And the SEED curriculum at Shipley stretches from pre-K through 12th grade, with character education in the lower school, respect, responsibility, and leadership in the middle school, and the seminar classes for upper school students. Our hope for the SEED extension events is to do just what the name implies, extend the concepts discussed in the seminar into the conversations that you all are having at home. While the content will change year to year, the core concepts will remain the same, focusing on self-awareness, relationship management, social awareness, and responsible decision-making. Steve Pilch could not join us tonight. He is coming home from a funeral. He sends his regrets because he was really looking forward to hearing Dr. Steinberg speak to us about the age of adolescence, and he was also looking forward to introducing Dr. Martin Seligman, who is director of the Penn Positive Psychology Center and parent of a 9th grader. Dr. Seligman is the author of countless publications and TED Talks. He was recently honored by the organization Minding Your Mind at their 6th annual Blue Jean Gala, where he was presented with the 2015 Changing Minds Award. And tonight, he honors us by introducing our speaker, Dr. Martin Seligman.
You're in for a treat tonight. Since Freud, psychologists thought that the events of childhood determined, or at least strongly influenced, adolescent and adult development. Childhood is overrated. Childhood is overrated. It turns out that when people bothered to look at the events in childhood and what their effect was statistically on adult personality and adult psychopathology, the effects were minute compared with the effects in adolescence and in adulthood. Now, the speaker tonight is someone who has finally talked sense about adolescence. Adolescence is, I know this is controversial, vastly more important than early childhood. Turns out a huge amount of funding has gone into ages 1 through 3. And what Professor Steinberg is going to talk about tonight is that's a period in which very young people are acquiring survival skills. But the crucial period for acquiring social skills, love and sexual skills, and vocational skills is in adolescence. Professor Steinberg is the distinguished science professor at Temple University. He's the winner of the largest award given in the social scientists. So a couple of years ago, he won the million-franc Swiss award, the Jakob Award, for the outstanding research in adolescence. He's written a signal book, The Age of Opportunity, which he'll be talking about tonight. And it's my pleasure and Shipley's privilege to you have speaking tonight the single leading figure in the world in adolescence, Dr. Larry Steinberg.
It's always a special pleasure to be introduced by a friend, and maybe triply special, because in the case of Dr. Solomon, not only a friend, but a collaborator and someone whose work has inspired me and whose work I've what I'd like to do tonight is to change the way that you think about adolescence. And in doing that, I want to change the way that your community here, your Shipley community, thinks about the way people this age should be educated and treated by society, and perhaps even how. I should say that although I do a lot of public speaking on this topic, I speak frequently to parent groups, and I speak frequently to faculty groups, and every once in a while I speak to student groups. But this is the first time I've ever done all three of those groups at once, so we will see how it goes. I think that the way that we think about adolescence in American society is fundamentally wrong. If you go to your local bookstore, if indeed any local bookstores exist anymore, but if you go to your local bookstore and you go to the section where they shelve books aimed for parents of teenagers, what you're going to find are a lot of survival guides. And if you go to Amazon or another online bookseller and you look for books on adolescence that are aimed at parents, even some that are aimed at young people themselves, you will see countless numbers of them that have the word survive or survival in the title. And this is the cultural image that we have of the stage, that it's something to be survived. I think of it as, for parents, maybe it's the root canal of raising children. It's the time when you just close your eyes and hold your breath and wait until it's over and hope that nothing tragic has happened. There's even a book, I'm not kidding, you can look it up yourselves. There is a book called How to Survive Your Dog's Adolescence. Now, if you look at books on infancy, you will not find a single one that has survival in the title. The way that we think about the early years of life and the way that we think about adolescence are very, very different. And what I hope to persuade you tonight is that this survivor's mentality has led us astray and is inconsistent with what we know about the science of adolescence. So I have been studying adolescent development for about 40 years, and I have studied thousands and thousands of young people from all walks of life, from the best private schools in the country, like Shipley, to the worst public schools in our inner cities, and everything in between. We just finished a study of about 5,000 adolescents and young adults from 11 different countries, ranging from some that are very affluent, like Sweden, to some that are very poor, like Kenya and Jordan, India. And my career to be involved deeply with the National Academy of Sciences in their portfolio of projects dealing with people this age, and I chaired the Academy's committee on the science of adolescence. So I told I'm in a pretty good position to tell you what science says about this age period. And there is an amazing disconnect between what we scientists who study adolescence know about the period and what the public is led to believe. I'll come back to this later, but one of my messages tonight is that if you think that the best you can do during adolescence, either as a parent or as a teacher or as an adolescent, is to just get through it, then you're missing a tremendous opportunity that you have. Because what the science of adolescence tells us is that not only is it not a time just to be survived, it's a time when people can really thrive. We just have to know how to do it. Now, clearly, having a more accurate, informed view of this age period is important for parents and for teachers and for young people. But it's important for society as a whole, because we all have a stake in making sure that the next generation of young people are happy, notice I use that one first, and competent and successful. So it's critical that we have a national conversation about how we're raising young people. One of the reasons it's especially important to talk about adolescence and to have this conversation is that this stage of life is longer than it has ever been before. It's been stretched at both ends. It starts earlier and it ends later. So let me talk about both of those ends. We think of adolescence as a stage that begins in biology and ends in culture. It begins with the biological changes that when people make the transition into the conventional roles of adulthood, work, family, citizenship. The age of puberty, which marks the beginning of adolescence, has been declining. It's been declining quite dramatically over time, and it continues to decline. Let me put this in some quantitative perspective. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average American girl got her first period, which is how scientists who try to measure when puberty begins do it for historical tracking purposes, even though menstruation is not the first event in puberty. But the average American girl got her first period at the beginning of the 20th century when she was about 14 and a half years old. And today, it's close to 12. But it has dropped very, very considerably in that relatively short period of time. And there has been a comparable drop in the age of puberty for adolescent boys. So today, the typical American boy goes through puberty about 2 years earlier than his counterpart did in the 1970s. And this trend is continuing. Pediatricians around the country are reporting an increase in the number of young people they are seeing at an earlier and earlier age, showing the beginning signs of pubertal development, like breast development in girls, now being seen among about 20% of American girls at the age of 7. So that's second grade that we're talking about. So this is a very dramatic and change. As I'll explain, this is important for some reasons that you probably haven't thought about. When we think of puberty, we think of the changes that take place in the body and in sex drive as a result of the hormonal changes that occur during adolescence. But what scientists now understand is that the same hormones that change the way you look and that change your interest in sex have dramatic effects on your brain. And so, to the extent that puberty is happening earlier, the way your brain is affected by being exposed to sex hormones is also happening at a young age. And this will make a lot more sense to you as I talk later about what these effects just are. So puberty is starting earlier and earlier. At the same time, it's taking longer and longer for people to make the transition into adult roles. So the average 25-year-old today, for example, is twice as likely to still be a student as her parents were when they were 25, and only half as likely to be married as her parents were at that same age, and 50% more likely to still be receiving money to live from her parents. And this extension of adolescence into the mid-20s is there for both men and women at comparable rates for both sexes. So this stretching of adolescence at the front end by the declining age of puberty and at the back end by the extended transition into adulthood has made adolescence a 15-year-long period today, from about 10 to about age 25. That is twice as long as it was in the 1950s, and it's 3 times as long as it was in the 19th century. So now maybe, when adolescence was a short period of time, it was possible to go into it thinking of it as something that you just survived. But now that it's a 15-year period, we need a completely different approach to thinking about it. A different way of conceptualizing what we want young people to accomplish during this stage of life and what we need to do as adults who care about them to help this be a positive time in development. Let me say a few words about why these changes have taken place, since you may be curious about them. The drop in the age of puberty has been due mainly to three factors. One is obesity. So there is a substantial body of science showing that individuals who have more fat on them go through puberty earlier. And as most of you probably know, there's been an epidemic of childhood obesity in the United States and other industrialized countries, and that has lowered the age at which people go through puberty. The second has been the exposure of all of us to chemicals in the man-made environment that interfere with normal endocrine functioning. These are called endocrine disruptors. And they mimic a lot of the effects of natural hormones on the body, particularly estrogen. These chemicals are ubiquitous in modern society. They are, many people believe that they're mainly in food. That's not the case. But they are in pesticides, and they're in cosmetics, and they're in many different types of plastics, perhaps even the plastics that you're sitting on right now. So they are in our lives, and our young people are being exposed to them at an early age, and this is affecting their biological maturation. A third, and very surprising factor that has lowered the age of puberty is exposure to especially the kind of light that's emitted by smartphones, and tablets, and computer monitors. This is a relatively new area of research. We've known for a long time that exposure to light hastens the onset of puberty. I don't imagine that many of you have much interaction with poultry farmers, but if you raise chickens for a living, one thing that you know is that if you want them to mature faster, you leave the lights on for more hours per day. And we know that young people who go through puberty earlier than those who grow up near the North and South Poles because they have more cumulative exposure to light over the course of their childhood. And it's only been recently discovered that artificial light, and especially light of the sort that's emitted by the devices that we all use, hastens the onset of puberty too. It does it, by the way. You probably know, right? How many of you know that using those devices interferes with your sleep? Right. So it interferes with your sleep because it affects the workings of melatonin in the regulation of the sleep cycle. Those are why kids are going through puberty earlier today. Why are they taking longer to become adults? Mainly for economic reasons. Getting a good job today requires a college degree at a minimum. And if you need to stay in college, not just a few years of college, but college graduation, then you're going to be dependent on your parents for a longer period of time, not making money for that period of time, and you're going to delay getting married, and that's going to delay having children of your own. And so economic factors have caused the transition from adolescence to adulthood to take place at a later age. Let me correct a misconception that many people have because of the way young people are often written about in the popular press. There's no evidence at all that today's young people are more narcissistic or more self-centered or lazier than their counterparts were. This is a portrayal of young people that has been with us since there have been young people. And every generation of adults has looked at the upcoming generation and described them as morally corrupt in some way. And my colleagues and I have looked at hard data on this from national studies that have administered the same questionnaires to people over the last 45 years or so. And questions that include questions about self-esteem and feelings of deservedness. And there's no evidence that millennials are any different than their parents were when they were that age. So the reason people are taking longer to become adults isn't because they're lazy. And it's not because they're spoiled. It's because it's the rational thing to do if you need to accumulate more years of education in order to function well in the labor force. So if you have older siblings, you students here have older siblings, and your parents are giving them a hard time about floundering and taking a long time to become adults, you might correct the record. There's nothing the matter with them as far as we can tell. So adolescence is a longer period of time. Now here's an exercise for those of you who are not adolescents to do just for half a minute. I want you to think back to your own adolescence for 30 seconds or so. Think back to that period of time and what you were doing, what you were like, who you were spending time with, and so on. So I know that when I do that, I find that I have more vivid and richer recollections of adolescence than I do of other periods of life. So I can remember things from 1967, when I was 15 years old, better and more vividly than I can remember things that happened last week. And so not only do I remember the people, places, and the events that I was exposed to at that time, I remember them with much greater detail. And what's odd about that, for me, is that my adolescence was very ordinary. I grew up in the suburbs of New York, not unlike the main line, in a comfortable upper middle class home. Nothing terrible happened to my family during my adolescent years. Nothing particularly wonderful happened to my family during that time period as well. It was kind of like riding the people mover in the Philadelphia airport. Just like one day rolled into the next. So why would I remember adolescence better than other periods of time? Well, psychologists have studied this, and it turns out, and this is consistent with something Dr. Seligman said, it turns out that almost everybody remembers adolescence better than other periods of life. It's something that we call the reminiscence bump. Now, it had been thought for a long time that the reason that there is a reminiscence bump is because of the kinds of things that happen to us during this time period. That perhaps because they're more memorable, everybody remembers them better. A lot of things happen for the first time that are quite momentous during adolescence. Your first love, your first job, your first beer, the first time perhaps you lived away from your parents. And so it had been thought for quite some time that that's the reason why people remember adolescence more than other periods of time. Turns out that that's not the reason. Because people remember even the mundane events of adolescence better than the mundane events of other periods of life. And it's not only personal events that people remember. Those of you who are students now, I can tell you that when you're an adult, you will really remember the movies and the books and the music during adolescence much better than movies, books, and music that you're exposed to as an adult. So it's not just personal events. So if it's not the nature of things that happen during adolescence that make us remember it so much, what is it? It's the adolescent brain. It turns out that the adolescent brain is exquisitely sensitive to experience. Very sensitive to experience. And this is a relatively new discovery, and it's part of a bigger story about the adolescent brain that I want to tell. That story has to do with the ability of the adolescent brain to be shaped by experience. This is a concept in neuroscience that we refer to as plasticity. Plasticity refers to the capacity of the brain to change in response to experience. So we've known for a very long time that the brain is very plastic early in life, during the first 3 years or so of life. And that's one of the reasons why we have had this long-standing national conversation about early childhood education and the importance of the early years because of this discovery that during the 0 to 3 period, the brain is very malleable, can very easily influenced by experience. It's a relatively new discovery that the adolescent brain is also a very plastic brain. So there are 2 periods, it turns out, of heightened malleability in the brain. The very early years of life and adolescence. Now, when we talk about the brain being changed by experience, a lot of people find this to be surprising or amazing, but it's not if you think about it. If the brain wasn't changed by experience, we could never learn anything. I mean, when you learn something, there has to be an underlying neural change, or else there'd be no way of remembering what you learned, right? Now, that means that the brain is also plastic during other periods. It's not just early in life or in adolescence. It has to be plastic in adulthood too, or else we couldn't learn anything during adulthood. But the brain is far less plastic in adulthood than it is before, and it's plastic in a different way. This explains why it's the case that some things are so hard to learn to do as an adult, and much easier to learn when you're younger, like learning a foreign language, which is much easier to do before puberty than after. Or certain physical activities. So if you haven't learned how to ski by the time you're an adult, it's going to be very hard to learn that. If you haven't learned how to play a musical instrument before adulthood, it's going to be hard to learn that too. It's not impossible, it's just more difficult. And the reason it's more difficult is that your brain is not as plastic anymore. So even though the brain is plastic during adulthood, it's a different kind of plasticity than it is during adolescence. In order to explain that, let me just say a few words about what we mean by changing the brain. And by the way, what this means is that when you see infomercials about changing your brain during adulthood, they vastly overstate how much you can actually change your brain in adulthood. So you should be a little skeptical of some of these pitches on television. The brain is best thought of as an electrical system. It's a collection of neurons, brain cells that are connected to each other, and electrical impulses flow from one neuron to the next along what become brain circuits. The neurons in your brain don't exactly touch each other. They have projections like tentacles off of an octopus or roots off of a plant. And these projections come very close to each other. And the tiny little gap between these and another is called a synapse. And when we talk about the brain development, what we're really mainly talking about are 2 things. One is the production or elimination of synapses, connections between neurons in the brain, or we're talking about the growth of this white substance called myelin, which is like an insulation that forms a sheath around the neuronal projections. And just the same way with wire in your home, electrical wire in your home, a neuronal circuit of neurons that is surrounded by a myelin sheath is much more efficient than one that is naked. And so an electrical impulse travels down a circuit that has myelin around it about 100 times faster than one that's not myelinated. So when we talk about the brain changing, what we mean really has to do with changes in the synapses, whether they're there or not, and changes in the amount of myelin that surrounds those neuronal circuits. During childhood and adolescence, there is rewiring of your brain going on all the time. Whole new brain circuits are being established, and whole brain circuits that you don't need anymore are being eliminated, which makes the brain function more efficiently. During adulthood, that's not happening anymore. There are tiny little tweaks to existing brain circuits, but there are no new circuits, no whole circuits that are eliminated. So one way when I teach about this that I try to analogize about it is that it's like the difference between remodeling your house and redecorating your house. So when you're remodeling the house, you're putting on new rooms, knocking down ones you don't want anymore, and putting in new wiring and new plumbing, and perhaps developing a new floor plan. That's what's happening in your brain during infancy, childhood, and adolescence. During adulthood, you're just redecorating your house. You're just changing the colors of the curtains and the carpets. You're changing your brain, but not in this extensive, transformative way. Now let's think about this for a second. What this means is that adolescence is the last time in human development when your brain is ever going to be this plastic. It's the last time in human development when the brain is ever this affected by experience. Now, as I will explain, this cuts both ways. Your brain can't tell the difference between good experiences and bad experiences. So the same plasticity of the brain, the same malleability of the brain that makes it a time when it can be improved, makes it a time when it can be harmed. And as I'll discuss a little bit later, this is giving us new insights into the impact of drugs on the brain during adolescence and why the effects of drugs on the brain are so much more harmful during adolescence, particularly in the early part of adolescence, than later in development. Now, I've been talking about the brain being plastic or being malleable. When it is plastic, it's not plastic across all regions of the brain at the same time. Different regions of the brain are plastic at different points in development. So a good example of this is the visual system of the brain, the part of the brain that allows us to see. This system is plastic during the prenatal period and during infancy. It loses its plasticity soon after that. This is why your vision doesn't get any better after you're 1 year old, because the visual system loses its plasticity at that point in development. You don't see any better as you get older. And that's because the visual system is no longer plastic at that point in time. The part of the brain that is most plastic during adolescence is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's right behind your forehead. We need to ask them what's going on in that part of the brain. Why is that brain important? What's it doing in adolescence? And why should we care if this part of the brain is plastic? The prefrontal cortex is the most advanced part of the human brain. It is what most distinguishes our brain from brain animals. It is your chief executive officer. It is the part of the brain that is the captain of the team. It is dictating how the rest of the brain is integrating information, decisions, whenever you're engaging in higher order cognitions, what we call executive functions. So things like planning and thinking ahead and weighing risk and reward. These are all governed by the prefrontal cortex and its connections to other parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is also very important for something that I'm sure you discuss in your seed curriculum here. And this is a capacity called self-regulation. Self-regulation is the word that psychologists use to refer to your ability to exercise control over your thoughts and over your feelings and over your behavior. The reason is that of all the traits that are important to possess in life, self-regulation is the most important one. All the things you can have in life, having strong self-control is the single most important one. Studies show that your level of self-regulation, your level of self-control is a better predictor of than intelligence is. It's a better predictor of success in the workplace than talent is. So if you're a parent, one of the things you want to encourage in your child is the development of strong self-regulation. And if you're an adolescent, one of the things you want to try to cultivate in yourself is stronger self-regulation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how you can do those things. But there are hundreds and hundreds of studies that find that individuals with stronger self-control do better in school, they're happier, they have fewer mental health problems, they have more satisfying relationships with other people, and they're less likely to get into trouble. At the other extreme, people with poor self-control, they have a lifelong liability. Some of you probably read about the Marshmallow study, the Marshmallow Experiment done by Walter Mischel. For those of you, how many of you have heard about the Marshmallow study? Good. Okay, for those of you who don't know, the Marshmallow study was a study originally done about 50 years ago at Stanford University in the preschool. And what Mischel did was to seat a preschool child at a table and put down a marshmallow. Actually, they use different kinds of treats depending on what the child wants. But let's just, for purposes of this, it's a marshmallow. You're 3 years old. You like marshmallows. You told me you like marshmallows. I'm putting you at a desk with a marshmallow in front of you. And now I tell you this. You have a choice. You can have that marshmallow now, or you can wait until I return to the room and I'll give you 2 marshmallows. You should go online and Google the Marshmallow Experiment, and you see these hysterical videos of kids in the marshmallow study. So some kids wait for about 15 minutes. Some kids wait, but they struggle. They sit on their hands because they can't resist grabbing the marshmallow. Other kids grab it and eat it, even though they know they could have gotten 2 if they waited longer. This is a test of what we call delay of gratification. Now, what's interesting about this study is that these individuals have been followed over time. They're now middle-aged adults. And the kids that were good at delaying gratification when they were 3 years old had higher SATs when they were adolescents, better grades in school. They were less likely to have health problems like obesity or substance abuse. They were less likely to be arrested. They had better jobs. They made more money. So this little test predicting how well people could delay gratification was predictive of how their you have when you're 3 is fixed. Remember, it's regulated by part of the brain that's plastic, so we can do something about it. But it does illustrate how important this trait is, how crucial it is to success in life. I study, part of my work is on kids who have gotten into serious trouble with the law, juvenile offenders. And in some of our studies, we try to predict which kids who have violated the law as teenagers become adult criminals. And the only psychological trait that's predictive of continued offending over time is impulsivity, poor self-control. Nothing else really predicts very well how kids who've been involved in the system fare over time. So it's a critical trait to try to develop. Now, having strong self-control is also really important as a protection against the things that threaten the health and well-being of every student sitting in this room. We have made incredible advances in the prevention and treatment of illness and disease during adolescence. From that perspective, it's one of the healthiest times in life. But yet, there is a 300% increase in mortality between childhood and adolescence, even though there isn't a lot of diseases. The major threat to health during this stage of life are things that kids do. They're behavioral in nature. And it turns out that adolescence is the peak age for engaging in risky and reckless behavior. No matter which form of risky behavior you graph, looking at age, you see the same pattern. The kind of risk-taking increases between pre-adolescence and mid to late adolescence, and then it decreases into adulthood. And this is true for crime, it's true for binge drinking, it's true for unprotected sex, it's true for cutting, it's even true for accidental drowning. And that's a statistic that interests me because there isn't reason to think that 18-year-olds should drown more often than 12-year-olds or 40-year-olds, but they do. And we know that it's not because they get tired. It's probably because they make bad decisions about when and where to swim. So if we could do something to deter kids from taking risks and engaging in reckless behavior, we could do something to really improve the health of adolescents. This is the main focus of my work as a scientist at our university. And what we're understanding now is why so much risk-taking goes on in adolescence. What's going on in the adolescent brain during this time. Remember before I told you that we need to think about sex hormones and their effect on the brain. So this is going to be really good news for those of you who are students and really bad news for everybody else in here. One of the things that sex hormones do to your brain is they increase activity involving a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is the main neurotransmitter in the brain that allows us to feel pleasure or reward. So when you're anticipating something good happening or when you actually enjoy something good happening to you, you get a little dopamine squirt, and that's what is creating that sense of pleasure and enjoyment. And because of the impact of sex hormones on the brain, there is more dopamine activity in the brain during adolescence than at any other point in development. What that means is that good things feel even better during adolescence than they do at other points in time. And what it means is that nothing will ever feel as good to you for the rest of your life as it did when you're a teenager. Dopamine is involved in all kinds of reward experiences. Sex, food, praise, money. It's all regulated by the same neurotransmitter. And the more dopamine you have in your brain, the more those things feel good to you. Now, think about this for a second. You're somebody who feels pleasure intensely. Intensely. You're going to be on the lookout for things that are going to make you feel good. You're going to go after those rewards, wherever they are, even if there are risks involved. What we now understand is that this increase in dopamine activity in the brain caused by sex hormones is what motivates a lot of risky and reckless behavior during adolescence. That's the accelerator. It's pressed down to the floor. The problem is that the prefrontal and so the accelerator is on the floor, but there isn't a good braking system in place. And one of the things that developing strong self-control means is developing a stronger braking system. And that is what allows us to regulate those impulses to go after those rewarding experiences that may be risky. One of the things that we've been studying in our lab at Temple is how the impact of peers on adolescent behavior affects this process. So let me tell you a story about my son, who grew up right down the road from here in Gladwin. When he was 14, he was sleeping over at a friend's house in Marion with a friend and two other girls. And they decided to sneak out of the house at around 2 o'clock in the morning to go visit a girl who lived in the neighborhood. And these are really good, nice, smart kids. This is how good they are. They left a note for the parents saying that they had snuck out of the house. So these 4 guys go over to this girl's house and they throw some pebbles at her window to wake her up. Now, Romeo and Juliet style. And they succeed. But what they also do is they set off the burglar alarm in the house. And a loud siren goes off. What do you think they did? Run, exactly. What they didn't know is that a silent alarm went to the Lower Marion police station, which dispatched a patrol car to the house. And so these 4 kids are running down the road in Marion at 2:30 in the morning, and they run right into a patrol car that's coming. What do you think they did? Run. So the four of them split off and they go their separate ways, and the police pick one of them to follow, and they find him, not my son. They track him down, they bring him home, they read him the riot act, they, tell him he shouldn't be doing this. So the other three went back to the house that they had snuck out of, and you can just imagine the conversation that ensued at this point. And I found out about it the next day when our phone rang at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and it is the mother of the girl. Do you know where Ben was last night? Yes, he was sleeping at Brad's house. Well, sort of. And then she tells me the story. And every parent in this room knows that it's very embarrassing to get that kind of a call from a parent of a child who goes to school with your child. You don't want other parents telling you the bad things that your kid has done. It is, I can assure you that it is really bad when that parent is your wife's gynecologist. So I call my son up on his cell phone and wake him up. So I can't remember whether it's Saturday morning or Sunday morning, I wake him up. Get your stuff together. I didn't use the word stuff. Get your stuff together. Meet me outside of Brad's house. I'm coming over right now to pick you up. Now, he's had like 4 hours sleep. So he's sitting out there and he's really groggy and his hair is all unkempt, and he gets in the car. Well, just loses it. He gets in the car and I said, do you realize that you ran away in the dark from armed police officers who think of conducting a burglary? What were you thinking? He said, that's the problem. I wasn't. So this stimulated 15 years of research in our lab to try to figure out why, and I don't need a show of hands on this because I know the answer. Why, as adolescents, we all do stupider things when we're with our friends than we do when we're by ourselves. I've asked that question to kids and to parents before, and everybody agrees with that. So what is it about being in a peer group that might lead adolescents to do dumber and riskier and more reckless things than when they were by themselves? That's what we study in our lab. And what we've discovered is that peers are so important during adolescence. They're such a source of reward during this time period that they activate the same brain regions that sex and food and praise activate in the brain. And they make teenagers much more attentive to the potential rewards of a risky choice and less attentive to the potential costs of a risky choice. And we've shown this now in a number of different experiments. We have even shown it in an experiment we did looking at adolescent mice compared to adult mice. And being with their peers has the same effect on them as it does on human mice. So, self-regulation. Number one skill to develop. Protects you against all kinds of things, improves your chances of success in life. Takes advantage of the adolescent brain, the opportunity that the adolescent brain provides. So what can we do to help build this? What can we do to help stimulate the development of the prefrontal cortex? We know some things about this. One of the things that's really important to do is to expose the brain to novelty and challenge. That facilitates prefrontal development. And I have gone around the country talking about this, saying that it's very important that schools challenge teenagers. That's what stimulates brain development during this age period. And I always get a question framed in the following way. Our kids are already stressed out. What's the difference between challenge and stress? The difference between challenge and stress is that challenge asks you to attain a goal that's attainable, and stress asks you to attain a goal that's not attainable. And so in order to challenge somebody, you have to present a task or a demand or a goal that's just a tiny bit harder, a tiny bit more difficult than what that person has been capable of doing in the past. If it's overwhelming, it becomes stressful. And stress, we know, is very bad for the brain. It produces excess amounts of cortisol. You've probably heard of cortisol. One of the things cortisol does is it eats holes in the myelin of the brain. And remember, myelin is really important for efficient neurotransmission in the brain. What I have seen going around the country, speaking in communities like this, is that many schools, I have no idea whether this is true for Shipley or not, many want a lot of work to kids to do, and that work is repetitive and time-consuming and stressful in its quantity. What helps kids develop intellectual power and self-regulation is challenge, not stress. You've probably heard a lot about research on the 10,000 hours and why you need 10,000 hours of practice to become good at something. What you probably don't know is that it's not 10,000 hours of doing the same thing over and over again. It's 10,000 hours that's structured in a way that exposes you to increasing amounts of challenge over time. You can bet that when Michael Jordan was at the gym before his teammates and after his teammates, he wasn't practicing the same shot over and over and over again. So challenge is what stimulates intellectual and social-emotional growth during adolescence, not stress. So one thing that we can do as educators is to make sure that when we are demanding things from our students, we're calibrating those demands to scaffold, that's the word we use as psychologists, to scaffold them to create a sense of challenge, not to create stress. The second thing that you can do to help build self-control is engage in certain kinds of activities that are known to build self-regulation. One of the ones that is proven to do so is mindfulness training. You can develop mindfulness through meditation, you can develop it through yoga, you can develop it through certain kinds of martial arts. And there's now an extensive research literature on this. That individuals who, and the one that's studied the most is meditation, that individuals who engage in meditation on a regular basis develop stronger self-regulation as a result of that. And that makes perfect sense because what you're doing when you're meditating is exercising control over your thoughts. You're bringing them back when you're engaging in that process. And there are lots of schools around the country now that are incorporating mindfulness training into their daily curriculum for kids. So that's the second thing that you can do. The third thing that you can do, which you probably aren't doing, is get enough sleep. Sleep is very important for brain health and is very important for prefrontal brain health. And we know that the average adolescent needs between 8 and 9 hours of sleep a night in order to develop in healthy ways. And we know from national surveys that very few kids get that much sleep. And as you probably know, there are many contributors to that. One is going to a school that piles on so much work that you can't go to sleep when you want to be going to sleep. A second is exposing yourself to light that's emitted from these devices that interferes with melatonin activity in the brain and makes it harder to go to sleep. And the third thing, which you students won't want to hear, is making yourself wake up at the same time every day, even on weekends, regardless of when you go to bed. And that's going to help regulate your sleep cycles. And one of the things you probably find is that you find it hardest to wake up and be attentive on Monday mornings. And then as the school week progresses, it gets easier and easier and easier. And by Thursday, it's not so hard anymore. But then unfortunately, Friday, you stay up late and you sleep in till noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it resets your sleep cycle back to that later wake time, which then makes it harder to get up on Monday morning. So one thing that helps regulate your sleep and helps have you get better sleep and enough sleep is to have a wake time that's consistent from day to day. A fourth thing that's important for self-regulation is exercise, aerobic exercise, which is really important. It brings blood to the brain, which helps the process of brain maturation along. I know you get enough of that at this school. It's really important. A lot of schools around the country have cut out physical education from their daily curricula, and that is a disaster in terms of kids' academic development. And physical education and conventional academic education are connected to each other. They're not two different things. They're part of the whole process of facilitating cognitive and social and emotional growth. Now, I want to leave adequate time for questions, but let me say just a few words about vulnerability during adolescence and then some closing comments. Because I said before that the same plasticity of the brain that allows you to improve self-control and self-regulation through these different practices, through challenge and knowledge, that same plasticity is also a vulnerability. I could have called the book Age of Vulnerability, but Dr. Solomon said, no, you need a positive title for a book. So I called it Age of Opportunity, because it is both. And adolescence is both a time of vulnerability and a time of opportunity. What do I mean by vulnerability? It's the most common age for the onset of a mental health problem. It's the most common age substance abuse problem. It's the age at which our brain is most stress responsive. We now understand that these are all consequences of the brain being so plastic and malleable during this point in time. And this is why mental health problems are more likely to show up during adolescence. And this is why it's so important to treat them during adolescence. So if you're out there and you're struggling with something, you should get help for it and not let it linger, because the longer it lingers, the harder it is to deal with and to treat. And mental health problems that are allowed to persist into adulthood become more and more intractable over time. And now my spiel about drugs. The part of the brain that responds to recreational drugs, the reward system of the brain, is very plastic and malleable during adolescence. And we know from a lot of research that exposure to cocaine, we know that exposure to these substances before the age of 15 is much, much worse for you than exposure after the age of 21. That's what the studies have looked at. In fact, if you begin using one of those substances before the age of 15, you are 10 times more likely to develop a substance dependence or an addiction than if you wait and have the same amount of that substance after the age of 21. And this isn't, by the way, just because the kinds of people that start early are different. Because scientists have shown this in studies of animals in which they are randomly assigned to be exposed to the substance right after they go through puberty versus randomly assigned to be exposed after they're fully grown adults. And the same finding emerges from that work as well. So it's really important to protect your brain health during this time period. I don't want to be alarmist. Experimentation with these substances is not going to damage your brain, but regular use will. The problem is that not all of us can experiment with those substances without going on to regular use. We know a lot about this from studies of nicotine. A third of all people that tried cigarettes before the age of 15 become addicted adult smokers. And people who don't have their first cigarette until after they're 21 almost never become regular smokers. The problem is that we have a hard time knowing who is prone to become dependent or addicted and who isn't. It's in your genes. You don't know what genes you have and whether you're somebody who is susceptible to that. So the most important thing is to stay away from these things until you're older and your brain is more hardened and less plastic and less likely to be affected. And then finally, I said that the brain is more stress responsive during adolescence. That's because the sex hormones affect the brain's stress system in ways that make it more responsive. The same amount of stress is more harmful to the adolescent brain than it is to the brain during childhood or during adulthood. It's another reason to not stress kids out. because it's going to have a more lasting impact during this time. So let me just conclude by saying that what I hope to have done tonight is to change the way that you think about this period of time. That it's not something just to survive, it's not something just to get through. It's a time that's a tremendous opportunity. It's a time that's an opportunity that is caused by the incredible plasticity of the brain during adolescence. And it's really important that we stop communicating, we meaning people that write for the public, that we stop communicating this message that adolescence is something to survive. It's not something to survive. It's not a problem. It's not a burden. It's an opportunity. And we need to make sure that we don't squander it. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to entertain questions about anything I spoke about, but about adolescence in general as well. Thank you all very much. For those of you who need to leave, people walk out on my lectures all the time, so it won't hurt my feelings at all. Question? All right, we'll take the second question. Yeah, okay. Yes. Yes. So the question is that many people who are parents here tonight are either soon or will be soon facing the launching of their kids off to college, when they'll be independent for the first time. And what do we know about development during this period from 18 to 22? And what advice can I give to parents about this? Well, one thing that we know brain maturation going on, at least until age 22 or 23, maybe a little bit beyond that. So this period of time continues to be a time of both vulnerability and opportunity. So all the things that I suggested that we try to do in college as well, exercise, mindfulness, challenge, novelty, and so forth. It's also very important that when your child is at home, growing up, approaching this period of time, that you give your kids enough experience with making independent decisions so that this is not a new experience for them once they're away at school. And a lot has been said and written about helicopter parenting, and I don't want to go over that territory again. But the way in which, so self-regulation is both cultivated through the kinds of exercises I spoke about, but it's also learned. And self-control can only be learned through experience. And if you're used to having your life controlled by somebody else, you're not going to develop strong self-control on your own. So it's very important to sort of calibrate this launching over the course of high school and into the early college years, rather than making it switch that you just flip when your kid goes off to school. What I think is really important for parents to do, let me say a couple things about this. There's no question that young adults, college-age students, are more in contact with their parents today than was true in previous generations. Part of that's because technology has enabled it, but part of it is good, because young people are closer to their parents today than they were in previous generations. So the challenge for parents is to figure out, what's my role in my child's life now that my child is no longer living at home? And your role should now be as the chief executive officer of a company where your child is an executive vice president, right? So you want your college-age child to be able to make decisions, and what you want to do as a parent is to help your child make those decisions, not to make those decisions for your child. And so when you get the phone calls, as you will from your child at college, asking for your help with something, the most important thing to say is, have you looked into where you can get help on campus for this? And to suggest that your child do that rather than solving the problem for your child. Because you want to help cultivate decision-making competence and self-control in your absence. Yes, in the back.
Our neighbors' kids go to the local public school,
Yes.
and they have dramatically reduced homework loads.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. There's a fan going.
They have dramatically reduced homework loads than the kids we noticed in many of the private schools. Are they ahead of the curve, or are things we can learn from what they're doing vis-a-vis that stress?
So the question is that that kids who, I assume in the Lower Merion public schools, are being assigned less homework. There's been a big reduction in homework. It's kind of a national movement that's going on now. And are they ahead of the curve, and are there things we can learn from that? You know, I don't know what the effects of the policy are yet, and probably they don't know yet either. I can say that the way in which you should be evaluating your child's homework is the quality of it and not the quantity of it. And you should be asking whether it is excessive in amount just for the purpose of repetition, which, as I said, does not enhance learning very much, or whether it is the kind of homework that continues to provide challenge and novelty to your child. So I would rather see kids have less homework that's of a better quality than more homework that is simply there for the purpose of repetition, because they're diminishing returns from that. I can't put a number on it, but I think that the issue is, the question is this piled on just for the sake of piling it on, or is there some intellectual value in this? And let me also say on that topic that I worry about overscheduling teenagers to the point where they don't have opportunities to make decisions about anything. And overscheduling comes in many, many forms. Some of it comes in excessive homework. Some of it comes in extracurricular demands and requirements. Some of it comes just by their parents scheduling different kinds of tutors and lessons and exercise. So adolescence is a time when kids need time just to kick back. And that also means unplugging. It doesn't mean being connected to technology all the time. But kids need time to just sort of process their experiences. And they need time to sleep. And they need time to relax. Particularly young people that go to demanding schools like this one. It is not good for them to feel crazed and stressed out, and not necessarily by homework, but by the schedule that they have to keep. Students, plug your ears for a second here. They're children, right? I mean, they're still children, and we still need to treat them in a way that's benign and protective, and not in a way that stresses them to the point. I was speaking in Italy 2 weeks ago at a science festival where a number of high schools brought their Italian kids to hear me speak. And I can tell you that this is not just going on in America. I mean, the Italian kids were in tears about how much pressure they feel under and how much work they're expected to do and how it's interfering with their ability to sleep and relax and so forth, and asking for advice about how to handle this. So this is by no means an American phenomenon, and it's by no means a phenomenon here. I mean, I've heard it in every major city in which I've given a talk that's similar to this. So we really need to look at that. Yes?
Vulnerable they are to mental health issues. Are there indicators
Yes.
where a parent can kind of be somewhat aware and say, wow, not just 13, 15, it's something I should try and help?
Yes, great question. In case you didn't hear the first part of it, the question goes back to what I said about adolescence being a time when there's the onset of a lot of mental health problems. And are there signs that parents or educators should be looking for, or young people themselves should be looking for? So the first and most important part of your question is this: that adolescence is a time of vulnerability, but it's not a time when mental health problems is normal, right? And we shouldn't look the other way if we think that a teenager is depressed or has conduct problems or is developing a drug or alcohol problem and say, oh, that's just what adolescents do. That's not the right way to look at it. So a good rule of thumb is sort of a 2-week rule. If you see a change in your child's behavior that seems fundamentally different, you know your kid, that seems fundamentally different, a kid who typically spends a lot of time with friends who now is by himself a lot, a kid who typically does well in school who's now getting really bad grades, a kid who normally is engaged in friendly, age-appropriate conversation with you now is avoiding you. If that, we all go through moods. If that change in behavior lasts for 2 weeks, I would have somebody check it out. It may be nothing. Hopefully it is nothing. But the first thing to do is I would just go directly to your child and say, hey, I've noticed this. Is there anything going on that that we should know, that you'd like to talk about? And your child doesn't have to talk to you about it. It can be a family physician, a counselor at school, maybe a therapist if it warrants that. But 2 weeks, if something persists for that long, that's not normal. Yes.
First of all, you've explained why I think so fondly of the 80s. My whole family makes fun of me for listening to the 80s station, but it's because I was an adolescent.
Of course.
Second of all, I'm wondering, you talked a little bit about genetic components to things, and when addiction or alcoholism seems to run in families,
Yes.
Is it because they all started when they were young? And I'm curious what the connection is there.
So we know that substance abuse problems like alcoholism run in families, and it's both for environmental as well as genetic reasons. So we know that vulnerability to addiction has genetic components to it. So some people can smoke. I mean, I smoked cigarettes as a high school student. Then I just decided to stop. So I mean, I was fortunate. Whatever I had in me did not incline me toward developing an addiction to it. Just a second. But environmentally, a parent has a substance abuse problem that's not being treated, that parent is not going to be as good a parent. And so one of the things that helps protect kids against using drugs is having a close relationship with parents who monitor, the child's behavior. So there's intergenerational transmission of substance abuse problems, for both, because both they're inherited, but also because of the way that family relationships are affected. But, yes?
You said
Hold your question until the mic comes down to you, because I can't hear very well.
You said that adolescence is extending an additional 5 years into the 20s. Are the changes in brain plasticity and other things also extending further, or is it just social aspect?
That is a terrific, brilliant question. And I actually, so if you answer, but if you're interested in a longer answer, if you email me, I'll send you an essay that I published in the New York Times last year called "The Case for Delayed Adulthood." So here's my thinking about it. What keeps the brain plastic is continued exposure to novelty and to challenge. It can't stay plastic forever. We know that there's at some point there are biochemical changes that stop that from happening. But to the extent that you can occupy yourself during those early adulthood years in activities that are continuing to challenge you and expose you to new and stimulating things, I believe that you can keep your brain plastic longer. So when you ask the question, is this a time of continued brain plasticity, I think the answer is, how are you spending the time? Sitting around watching cat videos on YouTube? Probably not. If you're spending it engaging in activities that challenge you and that continue to expose you to new experiences, perhaps we can. Great question. Thank you. Yes. Wait for the mic.
So there seems to be a lot of knowledge on what to do during and after your preteen or whatever. But is there anything to prepare kids for becoming, there doesn't seem to be any knowledge to prepare kids for becoming an adolescent?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I think the most important thing that we can do to prepare kids and to prepare their parents is to teach them about what to expect, to teach them about. I write articles and books for parents and for teenagers that explain what to expect. How not only the brain is changing, but how your body is changing, and how your thinking is changing, and how your relationships with your parents are going to change, and your relationship with your friends are going to change, and so forth. So I think we shouldn't allow adolescence to be a surprise. And the more you know what to expect going into it, I think well, we know this, it's not I think, we know this, that the more accurate your understanding is of adolescence as a period, the better time you're going to have with it. Yes? Oh, sorry.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about how to think about the difference between challenge and stress, because I was thinking back to when I was in high school, and there were probably instances in which I was asked to do things that to me produced stress, but to my parents appeared to be healthy challenges. So I wonder how we bridge the gap between those perceptions.
Right. Well, I don't think that the answer is bridging the gap between the perceptions. I think we know from studies of stress that stress is in the eye of the beholder. Right? That stress is a subjective experience, that you're in a situation that you can't control, that is going to have harmful effects on you. Now, there are a couple things that we can do in response to that. So one thing we can do is we can diminish the stress. Another thing we can do is to help teach skills for coping with stress. So when, and there are lots of things, and in fact this is one of the things that Dr. Sullivan studies and has studied for many years now. One of the things that I would encourage parents to do when your child is under stress, if it's academic stress, the first person you should be discussing with after your child is somebody from the school to find out whether, what your child is being expected to do is realistic. But the second thing for parents to do, if it is realistic, is to help the child figure out better ways of coping with the stress. So sometimes that means better planning, better thinking ahead. Sometimes it means understanding what's demanded in a way that's a more helpful way to do it. Sometimes it's teaching stress reduction, like relaxation techniques. Sometimes it's changing the person's mindset. So you probably have, many of you here probably have read or heard the work of Carol Dweck, Stanford psychologist, who's written a book called Mindset. And it turns out that the way that you think about your abilities is very important in predicting how much you're able to achieve and accomplish. So I don't think I think that parents and kids need to recognize that it's possible to have different perceptions of whether something is challenging or stressful, but that if a teenager says that I am stressed out by this, that there are solutions to it. We can change the stressor, or we can try to help the person develop better coping abilities. But let me just say that if you only have 3 hours in the day to do homework, and you're getting 5 hours of homework a night, no amount of changing your mindset is going to help deal with that. So I think it's important to diagnose the problem carefully and to figure out what's going on, rather than to say, well, this person's right and this person's wrong. Yes, oh yeah.
Many reports are also showing that for some teenagers, they are having too much self-control over themselves and ended up not living a good, calm life. So is there a way to overcome this?
I think when you say having too much self-control over themselves, I think what you're probably talking about is anxiety. And we do know that levels of reported anxiety among teenagers and college students in this country are much higher than they have been in the past. And I think, again, it kind of ties into that last question about trying to both minimize the stress that teenagers are under, but also providing them with the skills that they need to be able to manage the stress more effectively. And anxiety is often stemmed by feelings of being out of control and having to face some kind of experience or event that you feel you won't be able to handle. And anxiety is a normal response to that subjective appraisal of things. So, I would hope that in your SEED classes here, one of the things that you work on is developing coping skills to be able to manage stress in your lives. Not just how much homework you have, but stress, with your boyfriend or with your parents or on the job or whatever it is. We don't do a very good job of teaching that because we don't think of it as something that can be taught, but we do know that it can be taught. So if you know somebody who's feeling, I think what you're describing as exercising too much control is really secretly feeling out of control. And I think what we need to do is to help people develop the abilities to manage the demands and the challenges in their life in a way that produces healthy outcomes. Please just wait for the mic, it's coming.
If you had to recommend a book for students who are in the same situation that your son was in, so would be written to help them understand, and if you haven't had the benefit of hearing this talk, what would that book be?
Well, after Age of Opportunity, there's a good book by Dan Siegel called Brainstorm that came out a couple of years ago. Dan is a psychiatrist who understands kids very well and who wrote that book so that it could be read kind of and understood both by teenagers as well as parents. And so it's written he's a very gentle guy and he's a very gentle writer. So it's written in a way that I think young people will find helpful and explains the changes that they're going through and how this is going to potentially affect. So it's called Brainstorm. We will make this the last question.
You mentioned the damage of drugs before age 15. what is the difference between kids who have depression, anxiety, and they're taking anti-anxiety medicines, antidepressants, ADD medicines before the age of 15? What is the impact of that in the brain?
All drugs, of course, affect the brain. That's why we take them either because they're prescribed for us or because we're fooling around. I think we don't fully understand the long-term effects of those medications on brain development. What we do know is that it is better to take them and to thereby treat the problem that they're prescribed for than it is to not take them and have the problem. Because remember that these problems become more intractable over time. And so very few people have their first episode of depression as adults. It may not have been diagnosed earlier, but depression typically begins before, during the adolescent years. But if you wait to treat it until adulthood, it's harder to treat. So now, the one caveat I have about this is that the treatment needs to be supervised and managed by somebody who knows what he or she is doing. So these are not medicines that should be handed out kind of liberally by people that don't know, but they shouldn't be handed out by practitioners who don't have some specialized training in child and adolescent mental health problems. I can tell you that we know that nationally that's not going on, unfortunately. So the estimate is that about twice as many adolescent boys are on ADHD medication than would be predicted knowing how many adolescent boys probably have ADHD. So we know that it's being grossly overprescribed. And an interesting study was published last year on the behavior of parents in an affluent community. I can't remember where it was. In an affluent community where the parents would put their child on and off Adderall during exam times, to help their child concentrate when a big exam was coming up. And that's not how those drugs are intended to be used. So I think I guess that if a qualified healthcare practitioner says, your child has this problem and believes that medication is the most important or one of the components of the treatment for it, and if it's managed and monitored carefully, then the drugs are safe. But what we don't want is for people to be making their own decisions on whether to take these drugs or not, borrowing them from other people and so forth, or unqualified providers to be handing out these medications without having done a thorough workup. Okay. Good. All right. Thank you all.
Because I would like to really thank Dr. Steinberg for speaking to us and all of you that asked questions. I stopped myself from jumping up at the home really clear. There is no homework tonight. We want you to take what you had, and maybe I hope there will be conversations on the way home. But if not, then just do some of that mindfulness. And thank you so much for coming in again. Big thank you, Dr. Steinberg.
Daniel, I dig the costume. Thanks, man. This is actually my costume. This is the real me. So this is gonna be me from now on.
We were a little concerned that we realized you were the
Yeah, I mean, this is the real me.